Welcome to Into the Desert, where we'll be having conversations about relevant issues with respect and without finger pointing. If you'd like to join the conversation, please fill out your comments below, but remember to keep it respectful. We would like to foster conversation and not division. The Supreme Court versus the Constitution. When the Constitution was written, the founders saw the courts as the weakest and least threatening of the three branches. In recent years, the Supreme Court has become the site of political protests. The confirmation of judges has become fiercely fought political battles. What happened? Over the years since the Constitution was written, three factors brought about the change. The first was the history of the court rulings on the Constitution. Whenever there is a ruling, one side will like the ruling and thus will defend the court. Over time, the Supreme Court came to be seen as the final arbitrator for the Constitution. The court's role was respected, even with what are now clearly seen as bad decisions, such as Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson. A second major change was the court's move beyond a strict reliance on the Constitution to include other factors, such as social sciences, as they did in Brown versus Board of Education. Finally, the court's progressive dominance that came out of FDR's presidency resulted in an expansive view of the federal government's duties and rights, one in stark contrast with the founders' limited view of government. As a result, in the decades following the 1960s, these two distinct views of the Constitution and the court's role in interpreting it came into conflict. One is the living Constitution, the idea going back to Wilson, who described the government as a living thing. Wilson said,
"The courts are the instruments of the nation's growth."
He went on to argue that
their power is political.
An original view of the Constitution was a
straitjacket
to
a living government, the vehicle of a nation's life.
The court needed to be free to understand the Constitution in light of the changing circumstances of an ever-changing and growing society, a progressive society. Unfortunately, this meant the court was seen as increasingly political. While ideology, not politics, drove their decisions, the result was that they were making decisions that, in previous decades, had been left to the legislative body. At a minimum, they were making decisions that, until then, had been political, and thus seemed political. Those who tended towards the founders and the original understanding of the Constitution formalized into a competing view called originalism. As the name implied, originalism holds that the Constitution should be understood as it was originally written. If changes in society required changes in the Constitution, there is an amendment process, which has been done 27 times. The reason for the current battles is simple. These two views of the Constitution produce starkly different rulings. If judges are to take on a larger role in determining public policy, then who the judge is matters greatly. The Supreme Court under progressives had taken on this new role since the mid-1930s, and the living Constitution view was dominant following FDR's presidency. From the 60s forward, Republican presidents were appointing originalists. As the number of originalists grew, replacing judges with living Constitution views, the battle started and continued today. Originalists and living constitutionalists have been roughly equally divided for the last several decades, with one or more justices being swing votes. In 2018, Anthony Kennedy, then the swing vote, retired, resulting in one of the largest fights. In the end, Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed, giving the originalists a 5-4 majority. However, there were some questions that Chief Justice Robert was becoming the new swing vote. 2 years later, the originalist majority expanded to 6-3 with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett. Kavanaugh and Barrett's appointment gave the more limited view held by the founders their first majority on the Supreme Court in 90 years. Will this shift the focus of political battles back to Congress, as the founders intended? Time will tell. Thank you for listening to Into the Desert, exploring the wilderness of thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe and put your comments below. Remember, be civil. We want to foster discussion and not division.